Many years ago, in the middle of the 20th century, America asked a young man to go to war. It was the time of the Second World War. The United States was engaged in World War II from December 7, 1941, until August of 1945. It was a conflict which left few places on Earth untouched. It was fought on all the oceans, in deserts and jungles, in ancient cities, and in all the skies. Men flew lightnings and thunderbolts, Liberators and Mustangs, and engaged in combat at high speeds and bitter cold. When that young man went off to war, he left his home, his family, his school, his job. He didn't know it at the time, perhaps, but this ordinary, everyday American, and millions like him, were being asked to save the world. He became a member of the Army Air Corp. Believe me, they were glad to have him. Whether he was a pilot, a turret gunner, or a mechanic, that young American helped bring an end to the war. I'm Walter Cronkite. I believe that we owe that airman, your family's World War II veteran, an enormous debt of gratitude. We should never forget his courage, his sense of duty, his sacrifice. His contributions made possible the freedoms and life that we all too often take for granted. This is the best part of our nation's heritage. It's real. It's the story of one veteran, one of those everyday heroes who saved the world. Honor him, as I do.
My father was Walter Henry Brooks, Jr. He was the youngest of 6 children. He was born January 16, 1917, in the middle of a big snowstorm in Sheffield, Alabama. And he was born in the front bedroom of a little house on the corner of Atlanta and Columbia Avenues, still standing to this day. His father was from Tennessee. His father came to Sheffield in about 1890 to work for Southern Railway as a boilermaker. His mother was Lena Gray Brooks. She was from out in the country, Lawrence County, near Town Creek. As a kid, Dad could not pronounce the sound of R. So instead of telling people he was Henry Brooks, he would tell them he was Henny Brooks. And that's how he came to be known as Henny Brooks. Now, starting as a youngster, he always had a job. He was always working. He was a good worker, but he was a lousy student. In fact, over the years, he had to repeat 2 grades in school, which resulted in his being in the same high school class as a young lady named Sarah Stanley, who also worked at Olam's. And Sarah Stanley is my mother. In 1937, Mom and Dad both graduated from Sheffield High School. Now, Dad continued working at Olam's for another year. Then he borrowed $1,000 from the Lagermazinas and went to Chicago to study at the Worsham College of Embalming. He graduated from there in 1940, returned to Sheffield, and went to work at the Brown Service Funeral Home. He worked for a fellow named Jim Mays. He was unhappy working there, and during that time he was still courting Mother, and they married on March 9, 1941, at the First Presbyterian Church in Sheffield, which is where my sister Margaret was also married. Afterwards, they drove to New Orleans in Mother's 1938 Chevrolet for their honeymoon, and they stayed at the St. Charles Hotel there. Dad did not like working at the funeral home. He could not stand Jim Mays. So sometime in late 1941, he went back to Olam's. And around that time, Mother and Dad together were making about $200 a month. And of course, in late 1941, in December, on December 7th, Pearl Harbor happened. And Dad knew that he was going to have to serve in the military. He was only 23 years old. But he had a wife, he had a job, and he didn't want to go into the service immediately. So he worked out a deal with a fellow on the Selective Service Board. And this guy agreed to give him a signal when Dad's number was up, because Dad wanted to join, knowing that a volunteer could decide which branch of the service he would be in, whereas a draftee could not. So, sometime in September of 1942, about 10 months after Pearl Harbor, this fella came into Olam's, where Dad was working, and he kept trying on pairs of shoes, but he didn't seem to really want to buy a pair of shoes. And Dad interpreted that as his signal that he was about to be drafted. So based on that, he went and tried to join the Navy, but they would not let him in because he didn't weigh enough. So after being rejected by the Navy, he joined the Army Air Corps, and they told him to report to induction in Memphis, Tennessee in January of 1943. And so it was that in late January he goes to Memphis, then he goes to basic training in Miami, Florida, which lasted, I think, 6 weeks to 2 months. Then he went to Maryville College in Maryville, Tennessee, for 6 months of cadet training, mostly classroom work. Then he went from there to Maxwell Field, Alabama for pre-flight training, which again was more classroom training. After Maxwell, he goes to Orangeburg, South Carolina for flight training. Dad wanted to be a pilot. He wanted to be an officer. And so he goes to Orangeburg and he starts flying Stearman biplanes. Now, he was not a good pilot. He was too tense and too nervous. And after about 6 weeks of flight training, while he had flown solo many times, he was called in for a flight check on February 5th, 1944. And at that point, he was washed out, with the instructor telling him, look, you're a danger to yourself and you're a danger to others. So, Dad then went to Scott Field near St. Louis and was training there for a short period of time, and then he went on to gunnery school at Harlingen, Texas, to become a gunner. And at that point, really, his fate was sealed. He was going to be a gunner on a bomber, and he was going to be an enlisted man. But he did not know yet whether he'd be going to the Pacific or to Europe. So when his orders arrived, he was sent to California, and that meant he was going to the Pacific. So in August of 1944, Dad headed out from Harlingen, Texas, on a train to Los Angeles. And then he went up to a little town called Lemoore, California, which is where they had the fellows just hang out with each other, playing ball and seeing who got along with who. And then Dad went down to March Field in Riverside, and that's where his crew came together. Ralph Daniels was his pilot, Bill Bolding his co-pilot, Phil Reich was the navigator, Ed Farley and Johnny Pickett were Dad's two best friends among this group. They were also gunners. We have 10 members of this B-24 crew, 4 officers and 6 enlisted men. So during the months at March Field, the crew comes together and they're actually flying on B-24s. They're going out and learning how to bomb ships in the ocean. They're also doing long-distance training where they're flying as far east as Oklahoma. Because the B-24, of course, was a heavy bomber that was known for being able to go great long distances. And that's what this training was all about. Now, while Dad was in Riverside at March Field, Mother came out, and she lived there for about 2 months. And there's some great photographs of them there, including a time when they climbed Mount Robichaud. And then, of course, there's the famous picture when Dad is leaving, and Mother is saying goodbye to him, and he's getting into the car, and you can see it was a very sad occasion. So in late December, Dad's crew gets into a B-24, and they head up to San Francisco to Hamilton Field. Then they go over to Mather Field near Sacramento and await orders to go abroad. And they sit there for literally 30 days, just waiting for orders to leave. And finally, on February 12th, 1945, they fly out of Mather Field at Sacramento, going to John Rogers Naval Air Station in Hawaii. And I might add, in his letters, Dad does not know what's going to happen. So they fly to Hawaii. It's about a 13-hour trip. And they arrive there in Hawaii, and Dad manages to get a few hours leave, and he looks up his nephew, Bob Pugh. And Bob Pugh drives him around and shows him the damage from Pearl Harbor and shows him other sites there on the island. The next day, they get up early and head out for Canton Island, which is right on the equator. Now, Canton Island is just a tiny little blip out there, very hard to find. And there's nothing on this island. And Dad remarks on this in his letters. According to Ralph Daniel, the pilot, they landed at Canton Island, and they went out and practiced their shooting with pistols there on the beach. And they were just fascinated by this little island because of its desolation. The next day they head off from Canton Island, and the next several days they fly to Tarawa, which is where there was a big battle, I think in November of '42. And Dad finds his classmate Armistead Ross's gravesite there. They also visit Guadalcanal, Biak Island, and finally they land in Nadzab, New Guinea. And I might add, they're ferrying a brand new B-24 bomber over. And when they're flying around to these different spots, what they're doing is they're delivering mail as they head towards Nadzab. So they arrive in Nadzab, New Guinea. Now, Nadzab, New Guinea was a Japanese base on the eastern end of New Guinea, which the Allied forces had taken over. And George Kenny, who commanded the 13th and 5th Army Air Corps, had turned Nadzab into a training center. So while he's in Nadzab, he took jungle training with some Australians, and they started doing their bombing runs from there. Now at this point, Nadzab is just west of Rabaul, which was an enormous center of Japanese forces. And so Rabaul has been bypassed. There are 50,000 Japanese men on Rabaul, and there's a gigantic harbor there. And they've simply bypassed that, and they're just bombing them every single day. They have been doing this for a long time now. So Dad is involved in several runs from Nadzab where they go and bomb Rabaul. And they're primarily bombing the shipping in the harbor there. Another run he makes from Nadzab is bombing Wewak, which is, I believe, is on the north shore of New Guinea. So Dad is there in Nadzab from roughly February 22nd, 1945, through March 23rd of 1945. And at that point in time, he is assigned, and his crew is assigned, to the 307th Bombardment Group, which is a part of the 13th Army Air Corps. And they are operating out of the island of Morotai. Everything to the south and west of Morotai is basically Indonesia. And the Japanese controlled all of that territory. And what the Americans had done, what MacArthur was doing, was they seized the island of Morotai and were using Morotai as a spot to project American air power throughout Indonesia and disrupt shipping there and destroy the oil-producing centers, especially those centers around Balikpapan on the island of Borneo.
This, then, is the early Pacific pattern, pioneered and perfected in bitter opening battles which were fought simultaneously in the Solomons and New Guinea, and later in the Central Pacific. The pattern of airfields, the poison thorns that paralyze, the pattern that laid open what the enemy believed he had safely sealed. His Central Pacific bastion of Truk, hit from one side by the 7th Air Force and from the other by the 13th. His South Pacific bastion of Rabaul, hit from one side by the 5th Air Force in New Guinea and from the other by the 13th. All aided by the Navy's air arm as they vividly underscore the basic principle of Air General H.H. Arnold. Offense is the essence of air power. Offense in every combat theater and zone where wings soar skyward. Offense nullifying the Jap hope of trading space for time. Nullifying it with the one major weapon the Japs failed fully to appreciate until too late. The long-range airplane. Telescoper of time. Annihilator of space. And as a part of this offense, the 13th flies and fights.
So starting in March 23rd of 45, Dad is involved in bombing missions from Morotai. And most of his bombing missions are of the following kind. They are bombing airfields in the Philippines. They are also bombing oil facilities throughout the Dutch East Indies, especially Balikpapan. They're also bombing Makassar, which is at the southern end, I believe, of what is now called Sulawesi. They also bomb Brunei, which is the place where the Australian infantry will soon be invading to seize that area.
Target, Rabaul. B-24s of the 307th Bomb Group attacked the Rapapo Airdrome at Rabaul from an altitude of 18,000 feet. There was no zero interception and very little ack-ack. 4 days later, 1,000-pound bombs were dropped on the Vunakanau airfield from an altitude of 19,000 feet. Vunakanau airfield is about 10 miles southwest of Rabaul. 3 days later, B-24s of the 307th Bomb Group again attacked Rapapo airfield. En route to the target, the formations passed over the city of Rabaul. During March, the 13th Air Force continued to bomb the Rabaul area. The town itself was hit on March 8th by Liberators of the 371st Squadron of the 307th Group. The bomb run was made at 16,100 feet. Anti-aircraft was strong, but no enemy fighters offered interception. Storage areas were the principal targets. Our bombers struck at supply depots in an effort to destroy the means of subsistence of enemy ground forces. On March 12th, the town was hit again by the 371st Squadron from an altitude of 17,000 feet. Ack-ack was fairly strong.
On 7th January, the Luzon invasion convoy can be seen below as B-24s of the Morotai-based 307th Bomber Group rendezvous and then head for a strike on Nielsen Field just south of Manila. Operations meet heavy flak, but no enemy plane interception. Field, also south of Manila.
Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Rabaul, and Tarawa were left behind now as the Army Air Forces began to systematically destroy vital targets of the stolen Japanese Empire. Borneo, the valuable oil supplies at Balikpapan and surrounding vicinity were subjected to devastating aerial bombardments. These were long, dangerous missions, but they were worth it. The major supply of fuel for the Japanese war machine was destroyed, and the enemy on Borneo was softened up for the inevitable invasion that followed the heavy air attacks.
Preceding the June landings on the west coast of Borneo, the 13th Air Force pounded key enemy positions. On June 1st, Tarakan was bombed by 24 Samar-based Liberators. The same day, other Palawan-based planes were pounding the airfield at Kuching, capital of Sarawak, an important oil-producing port. Target coverage was 100%. In all these raids, 13th Air Force skeleton crews moved from their base on Samar to function as a small task force on Palawan Island. They achieved high success tactically and operationally. On June 6th and 9th, the Jungle Air Force bombed and strafed Labuan Island in Brunei Bay, scene of the initial landings on June 10th. Frags were dropped with good effect. Following successful landings in this area, concentrated air assaults continued as Allied ground forces spread throughout much of oil-rich North Borneo. On June 7th, the much-bombed Brunei Bay was attacked again. En route, the planes passed over the supply depot near Brookton on the Brunei mainland, which had been thoroughly cratered. 100-pound general-purpose bombs were dropped on Brunei, for here on June 10th, the major Allied landings were to be made. The area was quickly taken, and during the month, additional landings were made in other parts of Borneo. Under constant pressure, the Japs relinquished much of the island, and at the beginning of July, they were withdrawing from the rich oil area of Balikpapan.
Probably the most dangerous and famous mission they were involved in was an April 11th, 1945 bombing raid to Saigon.
This is the flight to Palawan and then on to Saigon. Here's what he says. He says that you left Pito Field at 2:45 in the morning on April 19th. All the gunners claimed to have hit Jap fighters, but due to the fury of the battle, no one claimed a specific number of fighters shot down.
Now, when you knocked that down, did you see a chute come out? Do you have any idea of the survivability of the pilot?
Oh, you didn't have time to look around. There was other fighters.
Concentrate on
you didn't have
protecting
time.
yourself.
You didn't have
So
time.
you were too busy looking around to see what else was coming at you.
Yeah, something was always there.
That's right.
Oh yeah. It was such a screwed up affair that I really don't know.
You mean the whole mission?
Yeah.
What was screwed up about it?
I
particularly, we had to circle the target twice.
Yeah.
And we had one airplane, I forget who it was, that had lost an engine. So we slowed the formation up to get him into the slot,
right,
to give him protection. And on the breakaway, it was screwed up. We actually, when we broke away, there was a Japanese strip, and it was used in Vietnam, close by to Saigon. And instead of breaking away toward the water, we broke over that Japanese strip, and we continued to get a lot of firepower from that. They were shooting pretty good, and the fighters we always kidded about was probably right. By that time, they had been able to land, refuel, rearm, and
come back
up again. Yeah. Terrible storm come up, as you remember, and it was dark.
Solid front.
It was solid front, and it was raining in 14 directions all at the same time.
Is this after dropping the bombs?
Yeah, after
dropping the bombs.
Yeah.
So y'all got separated from the formation?
Oh yeah,
at that
the
point?
whole thing got split up. And as we were driving up there, and we were coming up, and our ETA was up, as you remember, and there was nothing, absolutely not a rotten thing. And I had got on intercom, said, okay, we're going to go on a 360 and we'll punch off on one part of the 360 so we can get in the water together, because you don't ditch at night.
So you were ready to ditch.
And they had given us an alert situation that I don't remember what it was. No, I don't remember it all. But it was like every 15 minutes or 10 minutes or something, they'd turn on a big candle, and it would be on for 5 seconds, or I don't know what it was. Of course, the concern was they didn't want to illuminate the thing because of Japanese interception coming in there. And I remember so well that I leaned across, bolted, and looked out through his window, and so help me God, there was that light.
Okay. And you were about out of fuel at that point, right?
We were getting close, and I dumped it over, made a 90 to the right, and we landed.
Northward they go, pointing always towards Tokyo. Avenging airmen, bearing America's answer to the treachery of Japan.
Aborted mission to the Salivis, where the plane leaves Pito Field, but a gas leak was developed and seen by others.
Yeah.
The mission was aborted. The plane returned to Morotai after a flight of only 20 minutes.
We should have been killed.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
That's right.
Because when you take into consideration 100-octane fuel is being siphoned out of the fuel. The caps are that big around, and it's being siphoned out, and there was at least six places where it was being siphoned out, and it was pouring down over the trailing edge of the wing.
Waterfall.
And the flames from the turbo superchargers that were going back, the flames were at least that big around, and they were beyond the trailing edge of the wing. So the flames were really in the fuel.
Couldn't be in your gun positions during takeoff.
No,
I couldn't be in the nose. No one could be in the nose. So we were all in the waist, and we started to smell it, and we could look out and see this gas flowing by, and you could see those flames. We called the deck right away, and I went forward to get a hold of there's a salvo lever where they drop all the bombs at once if you yank them.
It opens the bomb bay doors at the same time.
By that time, Ralph had started to turn to go back, and I let the bombs go, and it threw them out into the water.
Was this something?
The runway, was right off the end of the ground and out over the water.
We did a 360, and
we just went around and right back down onto that.
By early July, Dad had participated in approximately 35 bombing missions. And in his letters to Mother, he describes 3 of those bombing missions as having been intense, where you had not only the flak, but you also had enemy fighters firing at them. Dad described to me one time that he had been hit by flak, where the flak penetrated and just hit his foot. It was a harmless thing.
Dropping bombs from minimum altitude was no longer risky because of General Kenny's idea, attaching parachutes to fragmentation bombs. In this way, parafrags could be safely scattered on enemy targets in low-level attacks.
They called us in because they couldn't land their troops because the enemy was all dug in just past the sand of the beach into where the trees began and the bushes, and they were dug in there with machine guns, and they were shooting at everything that came along. So we'd fly by and strafe that area. All the gunners would point at that area, and that wasn't doing anything.
There's ground support.
And they had frogmen out in the water, not too far off the beach, who were taking up mines. And these frogmen in those days didn't have tanks or anything. They had to come up and get air once and want to go back down.
My goodness.
Whenever they'd pop their head up, they'd be shot at. So they said, strafe that area. Well, we'd strafe it, didn't do a damn bit of good. So they said, bomb it. So I said, yeah, I think I can do that. So okay, one plane go through there and lay down a string of bombs right along where the sand meets the trees. And so far, I'd been very accurate with a lot of things. But this was a little low level, and we went by fast. And I didn't get cranked up just right, and I dropped those bombs instead of where the beach met the trees, I dropped it where the beach met the water.
Whoa.
And I damn near killed all these frogmen. And I felt really bad about it. I was really worried. But later we saw them come up and get picked up by the PT boats.
Yeah.
I know you've seen movies of them doing that. Okay, now it's 10 years later, and I'm an art director.
Art director?
Art director for a small advertising agency. I just started with them.
All right.
And there's two guys there who are artists. And I go to lunch with one of them the second or third day, and we're talking about all kinds of things. And you know, were you in the war? Yeah, I was in the war. He was a frogman. The Navy. I said, you were really? He says, yeah, I was in the South Pacific. I says, were you really? He says, yeah, I was in the invasion of Balikpapan, and you Air Corps guys damn near killed us. And I'm sitting there, and now I don't know what to do, and then I had this compulsion to confess.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I want you to know, I was the Air Corps guy that almost killed you. And I am so glad to see you sitting here alive. And I thought he was going to come across the table and strangle me. And then we became friends after that.
In August of 1945, of course, Dad and everyone else there learns that the war has ended. And so he is there in Morotai, and they go ahead and move from Morotai to Clark Field in the Philippines. And while he's in Clark Field in the Philippines, he manages to contact Billy Sanford, and they spend some time together. And Dad is there at Clark Field, and what they're doing now is they're just waiting to see who gets to go home first. The crew had a very difficult trip back. The trip back, the plane they were on caught fire. They had all sorts of problems, and they nearly crashed. In any event, the Dad eventually does return back to San Francisco and then to Sacramento. And then they put him on a train, and he takes the train up into Wyoming and down to Denver, where he stays at what he calls the Brown Palace Hotel. And from Denver, he takes the train on down into Oklahoma and winds up in Amarillo, Texas, which is where he was discharged. And then he takes the train from there back to Sheffield, Alabama, and resumes his former life. And I might add, just in thinking about his time overseas, it was interesting. He had a monkey, a pet monkey, while he was at Morotai. And the monkey's name was Susie. And the way he got that monkey was himself and Ed Farley and Johnny Pickett saw somebody. There were a lot of monkeys around. Of course, this is the tropics, and you've got monkeys all over the place. And so they saw somebody with a monkey, and the guy was not treating the monkey well. And so they put together several gallons of whiskey and traded the whiskey for the monkey. And while the monkey was technically the community property of those three men, apparently Dad took a greater liking to the monkey, and the monkey did to Dad than to anyone else. And Dad would sleep at night, apparently holding the little monkey's hand. I think that when they flew to the Philippines, they took the monkey with them, and they gave Susie away to a boy there in the Philippines. He gets back to the United States and goes back to work for Olam's, which of course was the clothing store where both Mother and himself had worked. And it was a difficult position because Dad very much wanted to have his own business, and he wanted to be one of the bosses. And Dad proposed that he be allowed to buy into the business. He was rebuffed. They did not want that. And so sometime thereafter, I think it was roughly 1946. I think in fact it was 1948. In 1948, Dad went ahead and opened his own store in downtown Sheffield. It was called the Henny Men's Store. Now, Jean, the first daughter, was born in November of 46. Margaret, the second child, was born in August of 48. Richard, or Dick, was born in February of 1950. And during those years, from 1948 on, Dad had a store. It was a clothing store, and he was competing with his brother-in-law, essentially. So it was an awkward situation. The store stayed in business for 10 years. And he enjoyed that business a lot. He loved clothing. He loved looking good. He enjoyed helping other people look good. Now, in 1955, Dad was appointed to the Sheffield City Commission as the Police and Fire Commissioner. So in addition to running a store, he was also helping to run the Police and Fire Department. And in 1958, he had to run for election in that position. It may have been 1960, either 58 or 60. And he ran and was elected again, and he would serve a total from 55 to 62 as the Police and Fire Commissioner. Now, in 1958, the business was not doing well, and he proceeded to sell the business to someone, and realistically, he walked out of that with almost no money. He just turned the lease over to someone else and sold him the inventory for a small amount of money. And in early 1958, he went to work for Liberty National Life Insurance Corporation as a life insurance salesman. And he started that job in the week of March 26, 1958. And I know that date because I was born on Wednesday, March 26, 1958, and that week he was training on his first week on the job. In fact, he was eating lunch at the Walgreens downtown Sheffield with his trainer when he received word that I had been born. So from 1958 to 1970, Dad was an insurance salesman. And he loved that work because he was able to get out and be with a lot of people. He enjoyed talking to country people. He enjoyed helping them with things that they didn't understand. And I think Dad really enjoyed that job. He did very, very well in the early years. In fact, in 1964, he was the Man of the Month for the entire company. And then in the mid-60s, he began to have some problems. Mother had come down with cancer in 1958, shortly after I was born. And the combination of our moving to a new house in Rivermont, which we did in roughly 1962, plus the expenditures for Mother's cancer treatment, plus the fact that Dad had started drinking too much, I think that the combination of factors were very difficult for him. He had a very rough time in the mid-60s, and eventually he did pull out of that. Jean graduates from Sheffield High School in 1964. Margaret graduates in 66. Dick graduates in 68. And during these years, Dad is doing a lot of church work. He serves on the Board of Deacons at the First Presbyterian Church. He also serves on the Board of Elders at the church. In 1970, he was having one of his best years economically he ever had. In 1970, he had made more than $20,000 just in the first 9 months of the year. And by today's standards, that would be more than $100,000 for 9 months, which for Dad was a lot of money. But unfortunately, he had other demons chasing after him. He had started smoking cigarettes when he was 10 years old. He had smoked cigarettes throughout his entire life. He had never watched what he had eaten. He had a very high-fat diet. And he also drank a tremendous amount of coffee. And he had never exercised, never taken care of himself. And while we did not know it at the time, he was a ticking time bomb in the sense that he had heart disease. And in 1970, he went to a University of Alabama football game, and it was Dad and his best friend Billy Sanford and Mr. McAllister and their 3 sons, one of whom was me. And I remember this day very vividly. It was a beautiful fall day, October 31st, 1970. And we watched the homecoming parade, and we watched the game, and Alabama won the game. And then as we left the stadium that day, we had a small automobile accident. Billy Sanford was driving, and Dad got out of the car and ran up a small hill and called the police and came back to the car. And then while he was there in the car waiting for the police to come, he started feeling ill. And Billy came in, and the police officer arrived and was taking the traffic report. And Billy Sanford asked Dad how he was doing, and Dad said, you know, my arms are hurting and my chest is hurting. And Billy Sanford knew that was the signs of a heart attack. And so he told the police officer what was happening, and we drove to Druid City Hospital, which was less than a mile away. And I remember at 5:30, we pulled up there, and they took Dad and put him in a wheelchair and took him in. And I knew right then, I was 12 years old, I knew that would be the last time I ever saw my father. And Mother arrived about 9:15. No, 9 o'clock she arrived. And we couldn't understand why they didn't take her in to see Dad. And unfortunately, he had suffered a heart attack earlier, and he started having a second massive heart attack around 9:15, and he died at 9:25. But that was the end of a tremendous time in our lives, and everything was very different after that.